I always thought the first time I saw my own blood would be in some small, controllable way. A scraped knee, a paper cut, something mundane and easily forgotten. Not like this, not pooling beneath me on the cold tile floor of a clinic that smells like antiseptic and fading hope. Not dripping in slow, rhythmic drops that echo louder than the pounding of my heart. It's strange how the mind reacts in moments of terror. It slows everything down, stretches seconds into eternities. And I remember thinking, absurdly, almost humorously, that I had worn white today. The nurse's voice was sharp, like glass breaking in my ear, calling for someone, anyone. And I tried to tell her I was fine, that it was just stress, that I had been dizzy before but the words wouldn't form, and instead a groan escaped my lips, low and broken, as another wave of pain seized my body. The walls began to tilt, the ceiling spun, and all I could see was red. My blood, his child, our secret, staining everything I'd tried so hard to keep pure. It's been 6 months since I ran from him. 6 months of pretending I could outlive the shadow of Dante Moretti, the man who made me forget every rule I ever believed in, the man whose touch had felt like a promise and a curse. I told myself I was protecting my baby, that distance was safety, that the world outside his reach was still big enough for me to hide in. But when your heart beats for a man like Dante, you don't really leave him. You only wait for the moment he finds you, and he always finds you. The world narrowed to the sound of monitors beeping, and the doctor's frantic orders, voices overlapping, cold hands pressing against my stomach. And through it all, I kept whispering, "Please, please don't take my baby." Like prayer could change the fate of a woman who'd already traded with the devil. Someone asked me for an emergency contact, and before my brain could catch up, before I could stop myself, I heard my own voice say his name. Dante Moretti. The room went silent for half a heartbeat, the kind of silence that means everyone knows exactly who that name belongs to. Then the chaos resumed. I must have blacked out, because the next thing I remember is the hum of rain against glass, the soft murmur of nurses in the hall, and the faint, sickly taste of iron in my mouth. The pain was duller now, not gone, just lurking beneath the surface like a predator waiting for me to move. I blinked, and the world came into focus. The IV line taped to my arm, the sterile sheets, the dim glow of the heart monitor. I was alive. The baby was. A door slammed somewhere down the hall, heavy footsteps echoing closer, faster, like thunder chasing lightning. I knew that sound. I knew that pace. My chest tightened, every instinct screaming at me to run. But where could I go? I was weak, trembling, trapped in a hospital gown that made me feel small and exposed. The footsteps stopped just outside my door. Silence. Then, the door burst open, and there he was. Dante. He filled the room like smoke, like danger itself had taken human form. The black suit, soaked through with rain, clung to his broad shoulders, his dark hair slicked back, a streak of water gliding down the sharp line of his jaw. His eyes, that impossible, ruthless gray, locked on me, and for a heartbeat I saw something raw flicker behind the fury. Fear. Elena. My name was a whisper and a command all at once. I wanted to speak, to tell him not to come closer, that he shouldn't be here, that this was my life now, quiet, normal, safe, but my throat closed around the words. He moved anyway, in that slow, deliberate way predators move when they've found what was lost. He was at my bedside before I could blink, his hand brushing the hair from my forehead, his touch gentle, reverent even, which somehow scared me more than if he'd shouted. "What did they do to you?" His voice was low, trembling with barely restrained rage. "No one did," I started, but he cut me off, his gaze darting to the IV, the blood pressure monitor, the faint red stains on the sheets. "You're bleeding," he growled, and I could see the calculation in his eyes. The way his mind was already tracing lines of blame, already deciding who would die for this. "Dante, please," I whispered. "I didn't want you to come." He laughed softly, bitterly, shaking his head as if the idea itself was madness. "You say my name and you think I wouldn't come? You call for me, Elena, and you think I'll just let you fade away? I didn't." "You did," he said, leaning closer, his breath warm against my cheek, his voice breaking. "You said my name, and the world stopped until I found you." Something inside me cracked then, because no matter how much I wanted to hate him, and God, I wanted to, there was comfort in his presence, a dark, terrible comfort that whispered, "You're not alone anymore." I wanted to reach for him, to lean into the familiar scent of his cologne, that mix of gunpowder and leather and something uniquely him. But then I remembered the reason I'd left. Because love shouldn't make you afraid. He turned toward the door, calling for someone. A guard, a doctor, I couldn't tell. And when they hesitated, he barked an order so cold it froze the air. "Get the best specialist in this city. If she or the baby dies, I'll burn the hospital down." I gasped. "You can't." "I can," he said, and for a moment, the mask of the lover slipped away, revealing the man the world feared. The one who ruled through blood and loyalty, who never begged but always took. "And I will, if I have to." The doctor appeared, stammering something about precautions and rest and needing to run tests. But Dante silenced him with a look. He sat down beside me, the bed dipping under his weight, his hand finding mine. His fingers were cold, rough, familiar. "You're safe now," he murmured, as if that were something he could promise. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to believe that safety could exist beside a man like Dante Moretti, that he could protect us without destroying everything in the process. But deep down, I knew better. Safety was never what he offered. What he offered was possession. Fierce, unwavering, and inescapable. The doctor left, mumbling about tests and rest, and Dante stayed, silent, watching me, watching the rise and fall of my chest as if daring the universe to take one more breath from me. The tension between us was thick, electric, full of everything unsaid. Finally, I found the courage to whisper, "You shouldn't be here." He smiled then, small and dangerous, the kind of smile that meant the world had already lost whatever argument I was about to make. "I go where you are, Elena. Always." And in that moment, as thunder rolled outside and the lights flickered, I realized something far more terrifying than his arrival. Dante Moretti wasn't here just because of me. He was here because he thought he was losing his air. The air seemed to thin, pressing against my chest, and I felt a chill crawl up my spine as his thumb brushed my stomach, as he whispered something in Italian under his breath, too soft for me to understand. He looked up, eyes like storm clouds. "You're coming home with me," he said, "where I can keep you safe." And though I wanted to protest, to scream, to tell him that his home was a gilded cage built on blood and fear, I could only stare at him, at the man who could destroy a city but trembled at the thought of losing his child, and wonder if maybe, just maybe, this was how it all was meant to begin again. There is something almost sacred about silence after chaos, that strange, fragile calm that follows an explosion, where every breath feels like a borrowed moment, every sound sharper, heavier, more meaningful, and as I lay in the back seat of Dante's car, wrapped in the faint scent of leather and rain, I realized that silence had never been my friend, because in silence, I could hear my own heart betraying me, beating not with fear, but with something far more dangerous, longing. Outside, the city blurred past in streaks of gold and gray, raindrops racing each other down the tinted glass, the night alive with the hum of engines and distant sirens, and somewhere beneath it all, I could hear the low murmur of Dante's men on the radio, speaking in clipped Italian, their words laced with urgency, like soldiers preparing for a siege. I knew that sound too well. It was the sound of him taking control, of turning fear into strategy, chaos into order, violence into something almost methodical. And yet, despite the calm way he barked commands, despite the unshakable authority in his tone, I could feel it. The tremor in his hand resting near my knee, the tightness in his jaw, the unspoken truth that for the first time in years, Dante Moretti was afraid. He didn't look at me for most of the drive, and I didn't ask where we were going, because I already knew. The moment he said I was coming home, there was only one destination possible: the mansion perched above the cliffs outside the city, the place I once called both sanctuary and prison, where love and danger coexisted like two blades pressed together. I had sworn I'd never return, that I'd rather vanish into obscurity than live under his roof again. But here I was, weak, trembling, the faint ache in my abdomen a reminder that my choices no longer belonged solely to me. When we finally turned through the wrought iron gates, the headlights swept over familiar stone lions guarding the entrance, their faces slick with rain, and for a fleeting second, it felt as though even they were watching, judging, warning me of the mistake I was making by crossing this threshold again. The car stopped beneath the awning, and before I could reach for the door, it opened, and Dante was there, his hand extended, palm steady despite the storm raging around us. I hesitated, because touching him meant surrendering to a world I'd fought so hard to escape. But his gaze, that impossible mix of command and desperation, left me no choice. His hand closed around mine, firm, possessive, grounding me in a way that terrified me because I wanted it, because it felt safe even when I knew it wasn't. He lifted me out of the car as though I weighed nothing, ignoring the men who stood at attention, their expressions blank, their eyes flicking briefly to my stomach before lowering in respect or fear. Inside, the air was warm, scented faintly of sandalwood and smoke, and I was struck by how little had changed. The marble floors gleamed like they always did. The chandelier still glittered above like captured lightning, and the silence was just as oppressive, broken only by the soft echo of his footsteps as he carried me through the hall. He took me to the same room I had once called mine, the room with the tall windows overlooking the cliffs, the one where we had both loved and destroyed each other countless times. And as he set me down on the edge of the bed, I felt a wave of nausea, not from the pain or exhaustion, but from the flood of memories clawing their way back. Laughter that had turned to shouting, kisses that had ended in bruises, promises whispered in the dark and broken by morning. "I'll bring the doctor here," Dante said finally, his voice low but laced with authority, that tone that didn't allow for argument. "You'll rest, you'll eat, you'll let them do whatever they have to do. I don't care what it costs." "You can't just—" I began, but he turned sharply, eyes flashing like lightning splitting the sky. "I can," he interrupted, his voice cracking slightly, betraying something raw beneath the steel. "I will. You think I give a damn about what I can or can't do when it's your life, Elena?" I wanted to fight him, to throw his own arrogance back at him, to tell him that this wasn't love, this was control wrapped in silk, obsession disguised as devotion. But I was too tired, too scared, too fragile to start a war I wasn't sure I could finish. So instead I turned my face away, staring at the rain streaking down the glass, and whispered, "You can't protect me from everything." For a long moment he didn't move. Then, so quietly I almost missed it, he said, "Watch me." The door closed behind him with a soft click, and I was alone again, though the room still pulsed with his presence, heavy and inescapable. I let my fingers drift over my stomach, feeling the faintest flutter beneath my palm, and for the first time in days, tears burned my eyes. not because of fear, but because I realized how much I wanted this tiny heartbeat to survive, how much I wanted to believe that even a man like Dante could change for something pure. But peace never lasts long in his world. An hour later, I heard the sound of wheels against the floor. The doctor, a frail man with trembling hands and eyes too wide for someone used to dealing with monsters. He checked me in silence, his voice soft but hurried, explaining things I barely understood. Stress, blood pressure, rest, constant observation. And though his words were meant to soothe, I could feel his fear, not of my condition, but of the man who had brought him here. When he left, he avoided my eyes, as though afraid that even looking at me might implicate him in something he could never escape. Later, Dante returned, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his tie gone, the faint smear of someone else's blood along his cuff. I didn't ask whose. He sat beside me without speaking, resting his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor as though the polished marble could give him answers. After a long silence, he said, almost to himself, "They'll say I'm losing control. They'll think weakness means blood." His voice darkened, every syllable measured. "But if keeping you alive makes me weak, then I'll destroy every man who mistakes love for vulnerability." "Dante," I whispered, not sure whether I wanted to stop him or comfort him. He looked up then, and for a fleeting moment I saw something that broke me. The ghost of the man I once loved before the world hardened him, before violence became his language and power his only prayer. He reached out, brushing his thumb along my cheek, tracing a tear I hadn't realized had fallen. "You shouldn't cry," he murmured, voice soft but trembling. "I'm fixing this. I'm fixing everything." But I knew he wasn't talking to me. He was talking to himself, to the guilt that had been festering since the moment he'd lost control of something he couldn't command with fear. He stood suddenly, pacing to the window, staring out at the storm that raged beyond the glass. "There are people who will use this, who will come for us now that they know," he said, his tone calm in the way only truly dangerous men can be calm. "You and the baby are leverage, Elena, and I don't let anyone touch what's mine." Something inside me snapped then, quiet but sharp, because as much as I wanted to be angry, as much as I wanted to tell him I wasn't an object, a possession, a thing to be guarded and claimed, I also knew that in his world, love and ownership were the same currency, and fighting that truth would only destroy us both. Still, I whispered it, because I had to, because the words felt like the last shred of defiance I had left. "I'm not yours anymore, Dante." He turned, his expression unreadable, his eyes darker than the storm. He walked back slowly, every step deliberate, and when he stopped in front of me, he leaned down, his face so close I could feel the heat of his breath against my lips. "Then why," he murmured, voice low and dangerous, "do you still say my name when you're dying?" I didn't answer. I couldn't, because he was right. I had called for him, and now he was here. And I didn't know if that meant I'd just saved my life or signed my soul away for good. He straightened, his voice shifting, colder, more composed, all trace of tenderness replaced by command. "You'll stay here until the baby is safe. No arguments, no running, no secrets." I stared at him, heart pounding, throat tight, and finally managed to whisper, "And if I don't?" A shadow crossed his face, and his lips curved into something between a smile and a threat. "Then I'll remind you what happens to people who try to take what's mine." The lights flickered as thunder cracked in the distance, and in that split second of darkness I understood. I wasn't a guest here. I was a prisoner. And as the first whisper of footsteps echoed outside my door, followed by the unmistakable click of a lock turning, I knew with cold certainty that the devil's protection had begun. Morning came slowly, crawling across the room like a ghost unsure of its welcome, its pale light creeping through the sheer curtains and brushing against the polished marble floors. the edges of the furniture, the silver tray someone had left on the bedside table. Fruit, bread, tea, all untouched because food had no meaning when fear sat heavy in the stomach. I lay there for a long time, staring at the ceiling, counting the faint patterns in the plaster, pretending for one fragile moment that I was somewhere else, somewhere ordinary, where the air didn't hum with menace, where the walls weren't lined with invisible eyes and ears, where every breath I took wasn't measured against what he might do next. The sound of rain had faded sometime before dawn, replaced by the low, distant rumble of the ocean crashing against the cliffs below, a sound that had once soothed me when I lived here, back when I still believed that love could soften even the sharpest edges, that if I loved him enough, I could pull him back from the darkness he wore like armor. I had been so young then, and so foolish, and it felt almost cruel to remember how easily I had mistaken obsession for devotion. I turned my head toward the window, watching the morning light spill across the heavy velvet drapes, and for a moment, I imagined the outside world, the city streets where no one knew my name, the faces of strangers who lived without fear of a man like Dante Moretti, the smell of espresso from the corner cafe I used to visit when I still had a job, a routine, a life. I wondered if anyone there thought about me, if the world had even noticed when I disappeared 6 months ago, swallowed whole by silence. The door opened without a knock, as it always did in this house, because privacy was a luxury Dante didn't believe in. A young woman stepped in, delicate, dark-haired, dressed in black like everyone who served him. Her eyes lowered, her steps soundless on the floor. She placed fresh linens on a chair, poured tea into a porcelain cup, and murmured a quiet, "Good morning, Signora," though she didn't look at me. I wanted to ask her name, to say something kind, something human, but when she glanced up for a second, just a second, and I saw the bruise blooming along her jaw, I bit the words back. Kindness was a dangerous thing here. It drew attention, and attention was something no one wanted from Dante's house. After she left, I forced myself to sip the tea, the faint taste of honey and jasmine catching on my tongue, and as I swallowed, I thought about how absurd it was that I still craved small comforts, warmth, sweetness, calm, when the rest of my world was built on violence. The door opened again, this time heavier, more deliberate, and I didn't need to look to know who it was. There was something unmistakable about the way Dante moved, the quiet authority that filled every room before he even spoke, the weight of his presence pressing against the air. He was dressed in black again. He always was. His jacket open, his shirt sleeves rolled to his forearms, his tie hanging loose, as though he hadn't slept, as though he'd been pacing through the night, plotting the destruction of whoever had dared to make him afraid. And maybe he had. "You're awake," he said. And though his voice was calm, there was that faint roughness beneath it, the sound of exhaustion laced with something deeper. Guilt, perhaps, though Dante would never admit to such a thing. "I didn't really sleep," I replied, my voice barely more than a whisper. He studied me for a moment, eyes tracing the shadows beneath mine, the curve of my hands resting over my stomach. And I knew that look. It wasn't tenderness, not exactly, but something close, something that wanted to be love if only it could remember how. "You should rest," he said finally, as if the command alone could heal exhaustion. "I can't rest when I don't feel free," I murmured, before I could stop myself, the words slipping out, uninvited, reckless. He froze, and the silence that followed was so sharp I could almost feel it cutting through the air between us. Then very slowly he walked to the window, pulling the curtain aside just enough to let the light spill across his face. "You think freedom is safe?" he asked softly without turning around. "You think running from me kept you safe?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to tell him that even though I'd been terrified and alone, even though I'd looked over my shoulder every day, wondering if one of his men had found me, it had still been mine. My fear, my choices, my life. But before I could speak, he turned, and his gaze silenced me. "You nearly died," he said, his voice low, almost trembling, though it would take someone who knew him intimately to hear it. "If I hadn't found you?" "You did find me," I interrupted softly, "and now I'm trapped." He closed the distance between us in 2 strides, his hand catching my chin, his grip firm but not cruel, forcing me to meet his eyes. "Trapped," he repeated, his voice quiet, dangerous in its restraint. "No, cara mia, you're protected, you're alive, you and the baby both. There's nothing I won't do to keep it that way." "You mean there's nothing you won't destroy?" I whispered. His hand fell away, and for a moment I thought I saw pain flash through his expression. Brief, raw, human, before it vanished behind the mask he wore so easily. "Maybe destruction is the only way I know how to protect what I love," he said finally, his tone distant, almost weary. He turned toward the door, pausing just before leaving. "You'll stay in this room until the doctor clears you. Anything you need, ask for it. Anything you want outside of this house, forget it." And then he was gone. Hours passed. Or maybe minutes. Time felt elastic in this place. And I found myself wandering toward the window, pressing my palm against the cold glass, staring out at the endless stretch of ocean below. The waves crashed against the rocks with relentless force, and I thought about how much I had once loved this view. How I used to stand here at night, wrapped in his arms, believing that the sea made us infinite. Now, it just felt like another kind of prison. Beautiful, vast, unreachable. As the day wore on, people came and went, the doctor checking my vitals, a guard delivering meals, the maid tidying the same spotless corners, each of them moving with quiet precision, never speaking unless spoken to, their fear palpable, contagious. I began to realize that everyone here lived in some version of my cage. Different shapes, different locks, but cages all the same. When night fell, the house changed. It always did. The air grew heavier, the silence deeper, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Somewhere below I could hear voices, low, tense, and the unmistakable clink of glasses, the murmur of Dante's men gathering, the sound of a kingdom on the brink of something. I moved closer to the door, heart pounding, straining to listen. "The Valeri family knows," one voice said. "They heard about the girl, about the baby. They think the boss is distracted." "Then they're fools," another voice answered, colder, sharper, one I recognized. Matteo, Dante's right hand, the man who never hesitated to do the things Dante didn't want his conscience to remember. "He'll kill anyone who breathes her name wrong." There was a pause, a murmur I couldn't quite make out, and then the sound of a door slamming, footsteps fading into silence. I backed away, my pulse racing, my hand instinctively covering my stomach again. They knew. Whoever they were, they knew about me, about us, about the baby. Which meant that I wasn't just Dante's prisoner. I was his weakness. His enemies would come for me because they couldn't reach him any other way. I sank onto the bed, my hands trembling, the weight of it all pressing down until I could barely breathe. For a moment I considered escape, imagined the window, the drop to the cliffs, the narrow path that wound down to the sea. But even as I pictured it, I knew the truth. There was no leaving this house. Not while Dante breathed, not while he believed the only way to protect me was to own me. The door opened again, quietly this time, and the same maid slipped inside. Her face pale, her movements hurried. She glanced over her shoulder before leaning close and whispering, "Don't trust anyone, Signora. Not even him." Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone, the door closing softly behind her, the echo of her warning hanging in the air like smoke. and for the first time since Dante had brought me here, I realized that the cage wasn't just gilded. It was cracking. Something was moving beneath the surface, something dark and inevitable. And whatever it was, it would shatter this fragile illusion of safety before long. The days that followed bled into one another, each hour dripping with the same slow, suffocating rhythm. The faint hum of medical equipment, the shuffle of footsteps outside my door, the muted conversations that stopped the second I moved too close. Time stretched thin within those walls, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. And though the world beyond the cliffs kept turning, cars rushing, people laughing, storms rising and fading, in Dante's mansion everything stood still, locked in that strange half-light between peace and danger. My body had become a battlefield I didn't recognize anymore, every ache and flutter a reminder that I no longer belonged to myself entirely, that something small and fragile was fighting inside me for survival. The doctor came twice a day, speaking in hushed tones, avoiding my gaze, always glancing toward the door as if expecting Dante to materialize from the shadows. The nurses changed, the maids rotated, but the fear in their eyes remained the same. A quiet, reverent dread, as though we were all living inside a temple built for a god who demanded sacrifice instead of worship. Dante stayed away for 2 days after our last conversation, and part of me wanted to believe that meant he was giving me space, that perhaps somewhere deep down he understood that his version of protection was a cage with velvet walls. But when he finally appeared again, unannounced as always, I understood that distance for Dante wasn't absence. It was strategy, the calm before he decided what to do next. It was late when he came, the kind of late that makes the air feel heavy, the sky beyond the windows bruised with night. I had been sitting by the window, a blanket around my shoulders, the faint glow of the lamp tracing the curve of my hand where it rested over my stomach, when the door opened and he stepped inside without a word. He looked different that night, colder, sharper, as if the weight of his empire had carved new shadows into his face. There were faint traces of exhaustion beneath his eyes, the kind that doesn't come from sleeplessness but from blood and guilt. His tie was gone again, his sleeves rolled up, and though he was every inch the man I remembered, powerful, magnetic, dangerous, there was something else there now too, something fragile hiding beneath the steel. "I thought you'd forgotten where this room was," I said quietly, my voice calm, though my heart had already started its nervous rhythm. "I could never forget," he replied, his tone soft but laced with something unyielding. He moved closer, every step slow, deliberate, measured, like approaching a wild thing that might flee if startled. I needed to make sure things were handled. "Handled?" I repeated, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. He stopped in front of me, his eyes searching my face as if the answer to his torment lived somewhere in my expression. "There were men," he said finally, voice low. "The Valeri family. They thought they could use you, use the baby, to break me." A chill crept through me, settling deep into my bones. "And what did you do?" His jaw tightened, a muscle twitching beneath the skin. "I made an example of them." The way he said it, flat, emotionless, certain, made my stomach twist. "Dante, don't," he cut in, shaking his head slightly, his voice trembling with a quiet fury. "Don't look at me like that, like I'm a monster for protecting what's mine." "What you're doing isn't protection," I whispered. "It's war." He leaned forward then, his hand gripping the armrest of the chair beside me, his face so close I could see the flecks of silver in his irises. The faint scar near his jaw I used, to trace with my fingertips. "Everything I have ever done has been war, Elena. The only difference now is the reason." For a moment neither of us spoke. The silence was thick, electric, filled with all the words we'd never dared to say aloud. I wanted to tell him that love shouldn't feel like violence, that safety shouldn't taste like fear. But I knew it wouldn't matter. Dante's world was carved from chaos, and he only knew how to protect by destroying everything else first. Finally, he sank into the chair opposite mine, his shoulders heavy, his hands clasped together. "The doctor says you're still weak," he said quietly, and though his voice was controlled, I could hear the strain beneath it. "You need to rest, you need peace, and I'll give you that, even if I have to rip it from the world myself." I stared at him for a long time, searching for the man I once fell in love with. The man who had held me in the dark and whispered dreams that had sounded like promises. But all I saw now was the king who had traded his soul for power, who would set fire to cities just to keep the ones he loved warm. "Peace isn't something you can steal," I said finally, my tone soft but steady. He looked at me then, and his eyes softened just for a heartbeat. "Maybe not. But I can buy time." That night I dreamt of blood, not the bright, terrifying kind that had sent me to the hospital, but the dark, slow kind that seeped through everything, turning love into debt, trust into currency. I woke before dawn, heart pounding, the taste of salt on my lips, and though the room was silent, I knew I wasn't alone. He was sitting in the corner, half hidden in shadow, a glass in his hand, his gaze fixed on me as if he hadn't moved all night. "How long have you been there?" I asked, my voice hoarse, raw. "Long enough," he said. "Dante." "I couldn't sleep," he interrupted, and for the first time I saw him as he truly was, a man unmade by his own need to control the uncontrollable. His gaze flicked to my stomach, lingering there for a moment, and his voice softened to something almost human. "I keep thinking about the sound of your heartbeat, and his." Something inside me cracked then, and I hated myself for the way my heart twisted at the sight of him, the way a part of me, the part that remembered his touch, his voice, the safety that came before the ruin, still wanted to reach for him. "You can't fix this by killing everyone who scares you," I whispered. He let out a breath, slow and weary, setting the glass aside. "You think I don't know that? You think I don't wake up every night wondering what I've done, who I've become?" He stood then, moving toward me, kneeling beside the bed, his hand brushing against my stomach, tentative, reverent. "But if the choice is between being a monster or losing you, I'll choose the monster every time." Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. "And what happens when the monster destroys everything he's trying to save?" He didn't answer, just pressed his forehead to my stomach, his breath warm through the fabric of my nightgown, his voice barely a whisper. "Then at least you'll live," he murmured. I closed my eyes, my hands trembling as I brushed them through his hair, torn between the urge to comfort him and the need to pull away. This was what loving Dante felt like, wanting him and fearing him, needing him and knowing that his love might be the very thing that killed me. Hours passed like that, the dawn creeping slowly across the room, until finally he stood, his mask of composure back in place. "I have to go into the city," he said. "There are complications." "What kind of complications?" He hesitated at the door, not looking back. "The kind that bleed," he said quietly. And then he was gone, his footsteps fading down the hall, leaving only silence and the faint echo of his promise lingering in the air. For a long time I sat there, staring at the place where he'd stood, my fingers resting over the faint flutter beneath my ribs. I wanted to believe there was still a future waiting for us beyond all this, something untouched by blood and fear. But the truth pressed heavy against my chest. Because no matter how fiercely Dante swore to protect me, the war outside these walls was creeping closer, and I could feel it now, pulsing through the mansion like a heartbeat, like a warning, like the calm before the storm that would tear everything apart. And as thunder rolled once more across the horizon, shaking the glass in its frame, I knew deep down that soon his war would become mine. I have always believed that silence has a weight of its own, heavier than words, denser than sound, a kind of invisible pressure that fills every corner of a room until breathing becomes an effort. And in the days after Dante left for the city, that silence settled over the mansion like a shroud. It clung to the walls, to the curtains, to my skin. It wrapped itself around me until I could feel it pulsing in my bones, a quiet reminder that though he was gone, his world, his power, his reach, his ghosts, still surrounded me, unseen but ever present. I tried to keep myself busy, though busy was a word that meant little in a place where time itself seemed to move according to his will. I walked the hallways, tracing the familiar patterns in the marble floor, letting my fingers brush the edges of picture frames that held the faces of men I'd never met, but whose loyalty had been paid for in blood. I watched the servants move through the house like shadows, heads down, eyes lowered, never speaking unless absolutely necessary. There was a rhythm to it all, a choreography of fear, and I couldn't help but wonder if I had become just another part of it, another thing to be protected, watched, controlled. The doctor came every morning now, his visits efficient and clinical, his eyes darting constantly toward the door as though expecting Dante to appear out of thin air. He said the bleeding had stopped, that the baby's heartbeat was strong, that I needed only rest and calm, though he said the last word as if he knew how impossible it was in this house. And when he left, I would lie back against the pillows and listen, really listen, to the sounds beyond the door. The muffled voices of guards stationed in the hall, the faint creak of floorboards above, the occasional metallic click of a gun being checked. Every sound reminded me that peace here was just an illusion, a fragile thing built on violence and vigilance. On the third night after Dante's departure, I dreamt of fire. I dreamt of the city burning, of the sky turning black with smoke, of Dante standing in the middle of it all with blood on his hands and my name on his lips, whispering it like a prayer and a curse. I woke with my heart racing, the sheets tangled around me, the taste of ash on my tongue, and in the dim light of the room, for a moment, I thought I saw someone standing by the window. A shape, a shadow, something that didn't belong. But when I blinked, it was gone, and I told myself it was only my imagination, that the dream had followed me into waking. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't just paranoia. I knew what it felt like to be hunted, to be followed, to have danger breathing down my neck. And this was it. That subtle awareness that the air in the room had shifted. That somewhere, somehow, someone had crossed a line they shouldn't have. The next morning, when the maid came to bring my breakfast, I asked her if anyone had been in my room during the night. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured the tea, her gaze fixed on the cup. "No one, Signora," she whispered. "We are forbidden." I wanted to believe her, but something in her tone, that careful, rehearsed calm, told me she was lying, or at least not telling me the whole truth. I didn't press her. I knew better than to draw attention to myself in Dante's world, where questions were dangerous and answers even more so. Later that afternoon, I heard raised voices somewhere down the hall. Sharp, male, agitated. And though I couldn't make out the words, I recognized one of them. Matteo, Dante's right hand, the man who had been his shadow since before I met him, the man who would kill for him without hesitation. I moved closer to the door, pressing my ear against the wood, trying to listen. "She's not safe here," Matteo was saying, his voice low but urgent. "You know it. They've found out where she is. The Valeri family isn't finished." A pause, then another voice. Deeper, colder. I couldn't place it, but something about it made my skin crawl. And you think he'll let her leave? You think Dante Moretti will give up his heir? She's not just the heir's mother, Matteo snapped. She's... The sound of footsteps interrupted him, heavy and deliberate, moving closer, and I stepped back from the door just as it opened. Matteo stood there, his expression unreadable, his dark eyes sweeping over me with something between pity and caution. "Eavesdropping is dangerous, Signora," he said quietly, though there was no true reprimand in his voice, only warning. "I heard shouting," I said, forcing my voice to stay steady. "What's happening?" He hesitated, glancing down the hallway before stepping inside and closing the door behind him. The movement was smooth, controlled, the kind of motion that came from years of training, a soldier's instinct. "Nothing you need to worry about," he said finally. "Don't lie to me, Matteo," I whispered. "I can feel it. Something's wrong." He sighed, running a hand through his hair, and for the first time I saw cracks in his composure. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, almost to himself. "You never should have come back." "I didn't come back," I said, my voice trembling with anger I hadn't known I was still capable of. "He brought me. He owns me." Matteo looked at me then, and though he didn't speak, the flicker of sympathy in his eyes told me he understood more than he could ever say. "Stay in this room," he said finally. "Keep the door locked. Don't trust anyone who comes in unless you see me first. Do you understand?" Before I could answer, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him, the echo of his warning hanging in the air like the shadow of a gunshot. That night I couldn't sleep. The house was too still, too quiet, as though it was waiting for something, or someone, to arrive. I sat by the window again, the moonlight painting the floor in silver, my hand absently tracing circles over my stomach as I tried to calm the unease that had taken root inside me. And then I heard it, faint at first, almost like a sigh, the sound of the lock turning. My body froze, every muscle tensing, my breath catching in my throat. The handle moved slowly, deliberately, and though I wanted to run, to hide, I knew it was too late. The door opened, and a shadow slipped inside, tall, silent, unfamiliar. I didn't scream. I couldn't. The man stepped closer, his face half hidden beneath the low brim of a cap, his movements careful, precise. I saw the glint of metal in his hand, a gun, and my heart stopped. "Don't move," he whispered, his voice low, accented. The world seemed to tilt. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. He didn't answer. He moved toward me, the barrel of the gun rising slightly, not aimed at me, but at the door behind him. And before I could process what was happening, the sound of footsteps thundered in the hall, followed by the crack of gunfire. The man turned, fired once, twice, and the silence shattered. The door exploded, open as two of Dante's guards stormed in, shouting, firing back. The intruder fell, collapsing against the foot of the bed, blood spreading fast across the rug, his weapon clattering to the floor. I pressed myself against the wall, shaking, my vision blurred by tears and shock. When the chaos settled, Matteo appeared in the doorway, his gun still drawn, his eyes scanning the room before landing on me. "He's dead," he said quietly, as though the words could somehow make it better. "Who was he?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He looked down at the body, his expression grim. Someone who shouldn't have been able to get this close. The implications sank in slowly, cold and terrible. "You mean someone inside?" He nodded once. "The enemy isn't just out there anymore, Elena. He's already inside." The guards dragged the body away, the blood smeared across the polished floor like a signature, and Matteo's words echoed in my mind long after he left. The enemy within. I sat there until dawn, the first light breaking over the horizon, painting the room in gold and gray, and all I could think was that Dante's war had already breached his sanctuary. And I was at the center of it. Because whoever had sent that man hadn't come for money or revenge. They had come for me. And when Dante returned, when he saw what had happened under his own roof, I knew there would be no mercy left in him at all. I have always thought that fear has a smell, something metallic and almost sweet, like blood left too long in the air, clinging to everything it touches. And in the days that followed the attack, that smell seemed to seep into the walls of the mansion, into the folds of my clothes, into my very skin. It lingered even when the floors were scrubbed and the body removed, even when Dante returned and the house once again came alive with the sound of his voice, that deep, commanding tone that turned chaos into obedience and obedience into silence. Fear lived here now, not as an intruder, but as part of the foundation, woven into the bones of the place, and no amount of light could chase it away. When Dante came back, the air changed. It always did when he entered a room, as though the oxygen itself bowed to him, recognizing the gravity of his presence. But this time, there was something different. The storm that always followed him wasn't only outside anymore. It lived beneath his skin. I could see it in the way he moved, in the tension of his shoulders, in the way his hands shook slightly when he thought no one was watching. He had been gone 3 days, but his absence had left cracks in the illusion of control that no amount of authority could repair. He didn't speak to me right away. When he entered the room, his gaze went first to the window, then to the corner where the blood had been, now hidden beneath a new rug, as though erasing the evidence could erase what had happened. His jaw tightened, his expression unreadable, and then his eyes found mine. And in that instant, I felt every wall I had built against him tremble. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low but trembling at the edges, the sound of a man who already knew the answer but needed to hear it from someone else because admitting it himself would mean acknowledging failure. And Dante Moretti did not fail. "There was a man," I said softly, forcing my voice not to shake. "He came in during the night. He had a gun. Matteo and the guards—" "I know," he interrupted, and the way he said it, quiet, deliberate, final, told me that he had already gathered every detail, interrogated every witness, extracted every confession. But still, he needed something from me. He needed to see how I had survived it. "He almost reached me," I whispered, my throat tightening. "He was inside the room, Dante. Inside." Something flickered behind his eyes then, something dark and dangerous, and before I could move, he crossed the space between us and pulled me into his arms. The embrace was sudden, crushing, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. Not because he was hurting me, but because it was too much. The heat of him, the trembling in his hands, the sound of his heart pounding against mine like a drum of rage and relief. "They got inside my house," he murmured against my hair, his voice shaking with fury so quiet it felt almost gentle. "Someone let them in. Someone I trusted." And then I understood. It wasn't just the intruder that had broken something in him. It was the betrayal. He pulled back slightly, his hands still gripping my shoulders, his gaze searching mine. "Did he touch you?" he asked, the words barely audible but heavy with meaning. I shook my head. "No." He closed his eyes for a moment, exhaling slowly. And when he opened them again, the softness was gone, replaced by that glacial calm that always preceded violence. "Good," he said, "because everyone who did this is going to die." "Dante," I started, but he silenced me with a look. Not cruel, not even angry, just absolute, unyielding. "Don't ask me to be merciful," he said quietly. "Not for this." I didn't argue, because what could I say? In Dante's world, mercy was just another kind of weakness, and love was its most dangerous form. But as he turned and left the room, his men falling into step behind him like shadows, I felt something inside me twist. Not pity, not even fear, but the terrible realization that every act of protection he made for me came with a cost that someone else would have to pay. That night, the mansion echoed with the sound of doors slamming, of boots on marble, of shouts that began sharp and ended abruptly. I stayed in my room, my hands pressed against my stomach, whispering words of comfort to a life that couldn't yet hear them, telling myself that the world outside these walls didn't matter, that what Dante did now wasn't on me, but I knew better. Everything he did was for me, and that made me complicit, whether I wanted to be or not. When he came back hours later, his clothes were different, dark and immaculate, his hands clean. But there was something about him, the way he moved, the distant glaze in his eyes, that told me blood had been spilled. He didn't look at me when he entered, didn't speak until he was standing by the window again, staring out at the storm that had begun to rise over the sea. "It's done," he said finally. "The traitor's dead." My breath caught. Who was it? He turned then, and his expression was almost tender, though his eyes remained hard. "It doesn't matter anymore." "Tell me," I insisted, though part of me didn't want to know. He hesitated, then said, "It was one of the maids, the one who brought you tea in the mornings." For a moment the room spun. "No," I whispered. She warned me, Dante. She told me not to trust anyone." He frowned, as though my words were a language he couldn't translate. "She confessed before she died." "Confessed to what?" "To unlocking the door." I shook my head, my pulse racing. That doesn't make sense. Why would she warn me if she was part of it? Dante's gaze sharpened. People lie when they're afraid. And what if she told the truth before she died? I asked, my voice trembling, anger and grief and disbelief all tangling together. What if you killed someone who was trying to help me? His expression didn't change, but his jaw tightened, his silence an admission he would never give in words. He turned away, his hands gripping the windowsill, the muscles in his back rigid beneath his shirt. "I can't afford to trust anyone, Elena, not anymore." "And what about me?" I whispered. "Do you trust me?" He turned then, his eyes meeting mine, and the answer was there. Raw, unspoken, terrible. "I trust no one," he said quietly. Something inside me broke then, something fragile that had been holding on through all the chaos and fear. Because I realized in that moment that love in Dante's world was never built on trust. It was built on possession, on control, on the idea that if he couldn't trust the world to protect me, he would simply remove the world from around me altogether. The rest of the night passed in silence. He stayed in the chair by the window, watching the horizon, while I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, feeling the distance between us grow wider with every breath. Outside, thunder rolled, low and distant, the promise of another storm on the way. Just before dawn, I drifted into a restless sleep, only to be jolted awake by the sound of footsteps. Quick, frantic. Not the measured stride of his guards. Dante was already standing when Matteo burst through the door, his face pale, his voice strained. "They hit the clinic," Matteo said breathlessly. "The one where the doctor came from. It's gone. Everyone's dead." Dante didn't move at first. He just stared at Matteo, his expression unreadable. Then slowly he turned toward me and I saw it. The realization, the terror, the fury, flicker across his face. "They're not after me anymore," he said softly, almost to himself. "They're after you." My pulse quickened, my throat tightening. "What does that mean?" "It means," he said, crossing the room in 3 strides and taking my face in his hands, his voice a whisper of steel, "that this war just changed." And in his eyes I saw it. Not fear, not love, but something far more dangerous. Resolve. Because Dante Moretti had always been a man who would destroy the world to protect what was his. And now, the world had just made me the battlefield. I do not remember the exact moment the line between love and terror vanished, only that one morning I woke up and realized they had become the same thing. Indistinguishable. a single trembling pulse beneath my ribs. The house that had once been my cage now felt more like a waiting room between heaven and hell, its corridors whispering with the ghosts of the living. Guards who moved like machines, maids who kept their eyes fixed on the floor, and me, a woman who carried both a heartbeat and a death sentence inside her. Dante's world had always been violent, but now it was something different, something darker and more fragile, as if even the air feared him. After the attack on the clinic, after the discovery that the enemy wasn't outside but inside the walls of his empire, something inside him fractured, quietly but completely. He became a man divided, half fury, half despair. And I learned quickly that loving someone who carried the weight of death on his shoulders meant living with the constant fear that one day he would crumble under it and take you with him. He didn't sleep anymore. At night I would wake to find him pacing the room, his silhouette carved in shadows against the faint glow of the sea beyond the window. Sometimes he would stop beside me, his hand hovering just above my stomach, not touching, as though afraid his touch might shatter me. Other times I would catch him staring at me as if trying to memorize my face, not out of tenderness, but as if preparing himself for loss. He never said it aloud, but I could see it in the way he moved, in the way his jaw tightened whenever the doctor came to check on me. He was preparing for the possibility that he might not be able to save us both. And maybe that was why, when the bleeding returned, he broke completely. It happened one afternoon, while the sky outside swelled with the promise of another storm. I had been sitting near the window, half reading, half dreaming, when a sudden sharp pain tore through me, low and violent, followed by a warmth that wasn't warmth at all. It was blood, fresh and unmistakable. I froze for a second, the world narrowing into a single point of panic before calling out for help, my voice thin and broken. The doctor came running, his hands already trembling before he saw me, and the moment his eyes met mine, I knew it was bad. He shouted for the nurse, for more supplies for Dante. But I knew before the door even opened that Dante would already be on his way. I could feel him in the walls, in the vibration of footsteps pounding up the stairs, in the thunder that broke outside as if echoing his rage. When he burst into the room, everything stopped. The doctor froze mid-sentence. The nurse flinched. The air itself seemed to recoil. Dante didn't shout. He didn't ask what was happening. He simply looked at me, at the blood staining the sheets, at the tears streaming down my face, and then turned to the doctor with the kind of expression that could make gods tremble. "Fix it," he said, his voice low, deadly calm, the kind of calm that comes just before something explodes. "Now." The doctor stammered something about complications, about needing to stabilize me first, about how the stress and the trauma and the strain were too much. But Dante didn't hear any of it. Or maybe he did, and it only made the darkness in him grow deeper. He grabbed the man by the collar, dragging him close enough that their foreheads nearly touched, his words a hiss that sent a chill through the entire room. "You listen to me," he said, his voice shaking not with anger but with terror. "You save her. You save them both. Do you understand? If one of them dies, you die with them." The doctor nodded frantically, his face pale, his hands trembling, and Dante released him, turning back to me, his expression breaking for just a heartbeat before he forced it back into control. He knelt beside the bed, his hand finding mine, gripping it so tightly it almost hurt, and I could see the fear he was trying to bury, the desperation he was too proud to name. "Stay with me," he whispered. "Do you hear me? Stay with me." I wanted to answer, to tell him I was trying, that I wanted to live, that I wanted the baby to live. But the pain came in waves now, sharp and unrelenting, and all I could do was cling to his hand as the world dissolved into flashes of light and sound. The doctor shouting, the nurse crying, the rain pounding against the windows, and through it all Dante's voice, low and steady, the only anchor I had left. There's something strange about pain. It can make time slow to a crawl, stretch seconds into hours, blur the edges of everything until you don't know where your body ends and the world begins. I remember hearing my own name over and over, sometimes from the doctor, sometimes from Dante. And I remember thinking how fragile it sounded, like a thread pulled too tight. Then just before the darkness took me, I felt it. A flutter, faint but real, deep inside me. And I knew the baby was still fighting. When I opened my eyes again, the world was quiet. The light was dim, soft, almost golden, and for a moment I thought I had died. But then I heard it, the sound of breathing beside me. Heavy, steady, human. I turned my head slowly and found Dante sitting in the chair beside the bed, his elbows on his knees, his face buried in his hands. He looked smaller somehow, as though the weight he carried had finally begun to crush him. "What happened?" I whispered, my throat raw. His head lifted immediately, his eyes bloodshot, his face pale. "You scared me," he said softly, his voice hoarse. "You stopped breathing." I tried to speak, but the words caught in my throat. He reached for my hand, holding it gently now, his thumb brushing over my knuckles, and I felt the tremor in his touch. "The doctor said you both made it," he continued, his gaze flicking toward my stomach, where a bandage peeked from beneath the blanket. "You're weak, but you're alive, both of you." Tears filled my eyes, but they weren't from relief. They were from the realization of what it had cost him. "What did you do?" I asked quietly. He didn't answer right away. He looked at me for a long time, his expression unreadable, before finally saying, "I prayed." It was the last thing I expected to hear from him. "You don't believe in God," I said, my voice barely audible. "I didn't," he replied. "But when I thought I was going to lose you, I started talking to someone, anyone, who might be listening." He laughed then, a hollow sound that broke my heart. Maybe he listened, or maybe he just wanted to see what I'd do next. There was something in his tone that made me uneasy. "What did you do, Dante?" He looked away, toward the window, where the rain had slowed to a steady drizzle, the kind that falls after the storm has already done its damage. "I made a deal," he said finally, "with myself, with whatever's out there. I told him if he gave me both of you back, I'd change." I stared at him, waiting. "And will you?" His gaze returned to mine then, sharp and unflinching, and I saw the truth in it. The terrible, beautiful, impossible truth. "I'll try," he said, "but I don't know if I can." He stood then, brushing a hand over my hair, his touch almost reverent. And for the first time since I'd met him, I saw not the king, not the criminal, not the man built from power and violence, but something raw, something almost human. A man who had begged for mercy and realized he no longer knew what mercy meant. When he left the room, I lay there in the silence, listening to the faint sound of his footsteps fading down the hall. And for the first time, I wondered if the price of surviving him would be losing him entirely. Because mercy, in Dante's world, was just another kind of death. The slow, painful kind that comes when a man finally faces the pieces of himself he cannot control. And I wasn't sure which of us would survive that. It was morning when I woke again, though the light that filtered through the windows felt softer, kinder, as if the sun itself was hesitant to intrude upon the fragile peace that had finally descended over the house. I had survived, somehow, and so had the child growing inside me, though the body that contained us both now felt like something newly assembled from shattered pieces, something no longer entirely mine. My limbs were weak, my breath shallow, and every movement was a reminder that I had come close, unbearably close, to slipping into the dark. Yet beneath the ache, there was something else. something tender and trembling. Life. The world outside was quiet, eerily so, the kind of stillness that only exists after violence. Somewhere, far below the cliffs, the sea roared softly against the rocks, the eternal rhythm that had outlasted every war and every love. I wondered then if it mocked us, our fleeting pain, our desperate battles for control, our endless hunger to hold on to what could never be owned. Maybe the sea knew something we didn't. Maybe it understood that all things return to it eventually, washed clean or drowned. Dante had not left the house since the night I almost died. I could hear him sometimes, his footsteps pacing the hallway outside my room, the quiet rumble of his voice when he spoke to Matteo or the doctor, though I couldn't make out the words. He hadn't come to me yet, and part of me was grateful for it, because I wasn't ready to face him. Not the man who had prayed to save me, nor the one who had killed to ensure it. I didn't know which version of him would walk through that door, and I wasn't sure which version of myself would meet him when he did. When the door finally opened, it was without ceremony, just the soft creak of the hinges, and the low sigh of air shifting in the room. He looked different, though I couldn't have said how exactly. Perhaps it was in the way his shoulders seemed less squared, or how his gaze lingered a moment longer than before, as if searching for something within me that might prove I was real. He had shaved, changed into a clean shirt, but beneath the careful polish I could still see the exhaustion etched deep into him. Not the physical kind, but the kind that comes from fighting too many battles at once, some outside, some inside, and realizing that neither can ever truly be won. "I thought you'd gone," I said softly, my voice fragile from disuse. He shook his head, stepping closer, his eyes never leaving mine. "I couldn't," he said, and though the words were simple, they carried the weight of every night he'd spent watching me breathe just to be sure I still did. He sat beside the bed, his movements cautious, as though afraid that the mere act of sitting too close might break me again. "The doctor says you're healing," he said, his tone measured, but there was something behind it. Guilt, perhaps, or relief, that made it falter, slightly. He thinks you and the baby are strong." "And you?" I asked quietly. "Are you strong?" He gave a faint, humorless smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've been better," he said, and there was something in his voice that almost made me reach for him, though I stopped myself. "There's been fallout. The Valeries are gone, but others are circling. They think I'm distracted. They think I've gone soft." I stared at him for a long time before whispering, "Have you?" He looked at me then, really looked, and for a heartbeat I thought he might lie. But Dante Moretti did not lie when it came to weakness. Not to me, not ever. "Maybe," he said finally, the single word heavy with meaning. "But I'd rather be soft and still have you breathing than be strong and bury you." It was the closest thing to love I had ever heard from him. We sat in silence for a while, and I found myself studying his face, memorizing it in a way I hadn't before. Not the perfection of it, but the flaws. The faint scar near his jaw, the tired creases at the corners of his eyes, the faint shadow of stubble that softened what was otherwise an unyielding man. He wasn't beautiful the way people believed him to be. He was beautiful in the way ruin sometimes is. Terrible, irreversible, and completely his own. Finally I said, "You killed for me again." He didn't deny it. He only exhaled, slow and controlled, and said, "I did what I had to do." "What you always do," I murmured, unable to keep the edge from my tone. "You make death sound like devotion." His eyes darkened, not with anger, but with something deeper, a kind of helplessness that I had never seen in him before. "You think I don't know what I've become?" he asked softly. "You think I don't see what this life has done to you? To us? He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his gaze fixed on the floor. Every day I wake up and tell myself I can protect you, that I can protect our child, and every night I realize it's a lie. Protection and destruction, they're the same thing in my hands. Then stop, I said, the words trembling even as I spoke them. Stop fighting, stop killing, stop pretending that love has to cost so much. He looked up, his expression unreadable. You think I can just walk away? You think they'll let me? You think the blood I've spilled will forget me? He shook his head, the faintest trace of sorrow in his voice. Men like me don't get to stop, Elena. We only get to choose what's left standing when the smoke clears. And what about me? I whispered. What do I get to choose? His eyes softened then, and he reached for my hand, hesitating for a moment before his fingers brushed mine. You get to live, he said quietly. You and our son, that's all that matters now. The word son caught me off guard, and before I could ask how he knew, he gave a faint, almost sheepish smile. The doctor told me, he said, his thumb tracing idle circles against my palm. He said you were too weak to hear it then. Our son. The words echoed inside me, strange and luminous, and for a moment everything else fell away. The fear, the blood, the endless noise of his world. For a heartbeat, it was just the three of us, suspended in something that almost felt like peace. But peace in Dante's world was always a fragile illusion, and it shattered as easily as glass. That evening, as the sky turned the color of dying embers, I woke to the sound of shouting in the hallway. Matteo's voice, sharp and urgent, followed by Dante's, lower but infinitely more dangerous. I pushed myself up, ignoring the pain that flared through my abdomen, straining to hear. They hit the docks, Matteo was saying. They knew where the shipment was, they knew, Dante. Someone's feeding them information. Dante's reply was calm, too calm. Then find them. I already have, Matteo said, and there was something in his tone, regret, hesitation, that made my blood run cold. It's someone close. Silence. A long, terrible silence. Then Dante's voice again, quiet as a blade being drawn. Who? I didn't hear the answer, but I heard what came next. The sound of a door slamming, the echo of footsteps approaching, heavy and unhurried, the rhythm of a man who had already decided what came next. The door to my room opened, and Dante stood there, framed by the fading light, his expression unreadable. Is everything all right? I asked, my voice trembling. He didn't answer at first. He walked to the window, his back to me, his hands clasped behind him. Finally, he said, I told you there would always be a price. Something in his tone, the quiet finality of it, made my stomach twist. What happened? He turned then, and his eyes met mine, and I knew, before he spoke, before the words even left his mouth, that whatever came next would change everything. Matteo found the leak, he said, and it leads back here. I stared at him, my breath catching. Here? You mean... He nodded slowly. Someone inside this house betrayed us again, and this time I'm not sure mercy will save anyone. The last light of day fell across his face then, sharp and gold, and for a moment I saw both the man he was and the one he could never stop being. And as the wind howled against the windows and the sea roared below, I realized with a kind of terrible clarity that resurrection, in Dante's world, didn't mean salvation. It meant rebirth through ruin. And the ruin was only just beginning. There are moments in life that feel as though they stretch across eternity. Moments when the world itself seems to stop breathing. When every heartbeat sounds like a countdown. When even the smallest sound carries the weight of revelation. And as I sat there in the fading light of the room, staring at Dante's expressionless face while his words settled into the air between us like falling ash, I realized that this was one of those moments. The walls of the house seemed to close in. the air growing thick, heavy, charged with the same quiet terror that comes just before a storm finally breaks. "Someone here betrayed us," Dante had said, his voice low and steady. But I could hear the violence coiled beneath it, the same way thunder hides beneath clouds before the first strike of lightning. I wanted to ask who, to demand names, to insist on explanations, but the way his eyes darkened as he looked at me made the words dissolve on my tongue, because somewhere deep inside, I already understood that this betrayal was not some distant, faceless act of treachery. It was close, personal, intimate. He moved toward me then, slow and deliberate, every step measured, the floor creaking softly beneath the weight of his presence. "Matteo's investigating," he said, though his tone told me that he didn't need an investigation to know what his instincts were already whispering. "Someone has been feeding information about my movements, about you, about the baby, to the people who want us dead." "Dante," I began, my voice trembling. "Who would—" He cut me off with a single look, the kind of look that silences everything it touches. "Don't," he said quietly. "Don't pretend you don't know what loyalty means in my world." It was a cruel thing to say, but I understood what he meant. In his world, betrayal wasn't about truth or lies, it was about survival. And survival always came at the cost of someone else's blood. Still, hearing him speak those words while standing so close to me, while his gaze lingered on my face with something unreadable, suspicion, grief, love, made my stomach twist into knots. "Do you think it was me?" I whispered, and though I had meant for my voice to sound strong, it cracked halfway through, betraying me. He froze then, and for the briefest second I saw something flicker in his eyes. Shock, pain, disbelief. But just as quickly it was gone. "No," he said, too quickly, too firmly. "No, of course not." But the hesitation was there. It lived in the air between us, heavy and suffocating, and I knew then that even if he didn't want to suspect me, a part of him already did. He turned away, pacing toward the window, his shoulders tense, his reflection fractured by the glass and the lightning outside. "You left once before," he said, his voice quiet but sharp, each word cutting through the silence. "You ran from me, you hid from me, and somehow they found you. You think that doesn't make me wonder how?" The accusation, even if unspoken, hit harder than any shouted word could have. "I ran to protect our child," I said, my voice shaking. "I ran because I thought distance was the only safety left to me. You call it betrayal, but I call it survival." He turned sharply, eyes blazing, and for a moment I thought he would explode, that the rage simmering inside him would finally spill out. But instead he exhaled, slow, controlled, deadly calm. "You think I don't know what it feels like to try to protect something you love?" he asked, his tone softer now, almost pleading. "You think I haven't killed for that same reason?" "Yes," I said, meeting his gaze, my voice trembling but unbroken. "That's exactly what terrifies me." The silence that followed was unbearable. He looked at me for a long time, and I could see the war playing out behind his eyes. The love that bound him to me battling against the fear that I might be the one undoing everything he'd built. And in that moment, I understood that no matter how much he loved me, Dante Moretti was still a man of his world, and in his world, trust was as fragile as glass, beautiful, transparent, and doomed to break beneath the slightest pressure. He finally turned toward the door, his hand lingering on the handle, and said without looking back, "Matteo will question everyone. Until we know who's responsible, no one leaves this house, not even you." And then he was gone. The hours that followed stretched endlessly, filled with the muffled sounds of voices down the hall, of footsteps moving from room to room, of doors opening and closing. I sat in silence, trying to steady my breathing, trying to convince myself that Dante didn't truly believe I could ever betray him. But the more I replayed his words, the more uncertain I became. I knew how fear twisted perception, how love and paranoia could feed each other until one devoured the other entirely. When Matteo came to see me later, his face was drawn, his eyes shadowed by exhaustion and something heavier. Regret, perhaps. "He's lost control," Matteo said quietly, standing just inside the doorway, his hand resting on the frame. "He won't admit it, but he's unraveling. The attack at the clinic, the traitor, the baby. It's too much." "Then stop him," I said, the desperation rising in my voice before I could stop it. "You're the only one who can." Matteo gave a small, bitter smile. "No one stops Dante Moretti. You know that better than anyone." I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. "He thinks it was me," I whispered. He didn't answer right away, but his silence was enough. "He doesn't want to," he said finally, "but he's afraid. And when Dante's afraid, he becomes dangerous." That night I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, too still, the kind of silence that hides violence beneath it. I kept replaying every moment in my head, every conversation, every glance, every word that might have sounded wrong, searching for something, anything, that could have convinced him of my loyalty. But all I could find were cracks, small and widening, running through the foundation of what little trust we still had. At some point near dawn, I heard the faint creak of the floorboards outside my door. A sound so soft I might have imagined it, if not for the unmistakable sense of presence, of someone standing just beyond the threshold. I sat up, my pulse racing, straining to hear. But whoever it was didn't move, didn't knock, didn't speak. And then, just as silently as they had arrived, they were gone. When I finally drifted into a restless half-sleep, I dreamt of fire again. The mansion engulfed in flames, the ocean below glowing red. Dante standing at the edge of the cliff with our son in his arms, his face unreadable as he whispered, "I told you mercy has a price." I woke to screaming. The noise came from downstairs, sharp, panicked, human. And before I could even process what was happening, the door burst open and Matteo stormed in, his gun drawn, his face pale. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice rough. "What's happening?" I demanded, my heart pounding, but he was already gone, the sound of his footsteps vanishing down the corridor. I swung my legs off the bed, ignoring the weakness in my body, the dizziness that threatened to pull me back down. The screams had stopped, replaced now by shouting, by the unmistakable sound of chaos. Breaking glass, slamming doors, the echo of gunfire. I stumbled to the window, pulling the curtain aside just in time to see the flash of headlights outside, the blur of movement. Men running, shadows crossing the courtyard, the world erupting in sudden violent motion. And then I saw him. Dante. He was standing near the main entrance, his gun raised, his expression cold and precise, barking orders as his men returned fire into the darkness. I pressed my hand to the glass, calling his name though he couldn't possibly hear me. Another explosion, louder this time, closer, shook the walls, and the lights flickered. Somewhere beneath the house, something collapsed with a terrible, hollow sound. I turned toward the door, ready to run, to find him, to make sure he was alive. But before I could take a step, the lights went out completely. And in the darkness, I heard a single sound. A whisper, close and chilling, right behind me. "He knows." I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was no one there. Only the sound of footsteps retreating down the hall and the faint smell of smoke creeping beneath the door. For a long moment, I couldn't move. Then, as the first lick of flame crawled up the wall beside me, I realized with a kind of cold, electric certainty that whoever had betrayed him hadn't finished their work. And this time, they hadn't come for information. They had come for me. The air was thick with smoke and fear, the kind that claws its way down your throat and settles heavy in your chest until even breathing feels like an act of defiance. And as the fire spread along the walls of the room, painting the ceiling in trembling shades of orange and gold, I realized that this terrible, beautiful moment was the ending we had both been walking toward since the first time Dante Moretti touched my soul with hands too rough for salvation. Every step, every argument, every kiss that tasted like both love and ruin had been leading here, to a night where the house that held our sins would finally burn them clean. I stumbled toward the door, the world around me a blur of heat and smoke, my lungs screaming for air, my vision swimming. Somewhere beyond the walls I could still hear the gunfire, short bursts, like thunder breaking in the distance, and Dante's voice, shouting orders, desperate, furious. It was a sound I had come to know too well, that blend of command and fear. And even in the chaos, it struck something deep inside me, something primal and unbreakable. Because no matter how much I'd tried to hate him, no matter how many times I'd sworn to leave him, part of me had always known that I would run toward that voice until the end. I threw my shoulder against the door, the handle hot beneath my palm, the heat biting into my skin as the wood gave way with a groan. The hallway beyond was a corridor of flame, the smoke curling along the ceiling like dark silk, and every breath burned. I could hear footsteps somewhere below, men shouting Dante's name, the echo of Matteo's voice cutting through the chaos, and all I could think was get to him. Get to him before the fire does, before the bullets do, before everything falls apart again. Each step was a battle, my body weak, the pain from my healing wound pulsing like a heartbeat beneath my ribs. I clutched the wall for balance, the marble slick with heat and soot, my eyes stinging. As I turned the corner toward the main staircase, the world seemed to tilt, the heat growing unbearable, and for a moment, I thought I might fall. But then I saw him. Below, at the base of the stairs, framed by firelight, his suit torn, his face streaked with blood and smoke, his gun still raised in one hand, and when his eyes met mine through the haze, something inside me broke completely. "Elena!" he shouted, his voice raw, his expression twisting from command to terror in an instant. "Stay there, don't move." But I couldn't. The stairs were already cracking beneath the weight of the fire, the railing collapsing in pieces, and every second I stayed meant another second closer to death. I tried to move down, one step, then another, the world spinning, the sound of the fire deafening, until the next step gave way entirely and I fell, weightless for a moment before crashing into the landing below. The pain shot through me like lightning, and for a heartbeat, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes again, he was there. Dante kneeling beside me, his arms sliding beneath me, lifting me as though I weighed nothing, his voice shaking as he whispered my name over and over like a prayer he didn't believe I deserved to speak. "I've got you," he murmured, pressing his forehead to mine, his breath hot against my skin. I've got you, I'm here." "Dante?" I gasped, my voice barely audible. "The baby?" "He's fine," he said quickly, though I didn't know if it was truth or hope, only that I needed to believe it. He glanced up as Matteo appeared at the top of the stairs, his face pale beneath the smoke. "They're inside!" Matteo shouted. "We have to go now!" Dante stood, his arms tightening around me, and as he carried me toward the main hall, I could feel the tremor in his chest, the way his breath caught each time the fire flared. The house, his empire, his kingdom, his prison, was falling apart around us, and still, he moved forward with the same unrelenting force that had made men fear him and follow him in equal measure. When we reached the front doors, Matteo and 2 of the guards were already there, struggling to force them open against the weight of debris that had fallen outside. Dante set me down gently, his hands framing my face for a moment, his eyes searching mine. "You need to run," he said, his voice shaking. Do you understand me? You run, and you don't look back. I'm not leaving you, I whispered, reaching for him, my fingers catching his sleeve. He caught my hand, pressing it to his lips. You already did once, he said softly, the faintest trace of a broken smile crossing his face. And I let you. I can't let you again, not like this. Dante! But before I could finish, the sound of gunfire ripped through the air, sharp and immediate. One of the guards fell, Matteo firing back into the smoke, shouting for Dante to move. Dante turned, drawing his weapon, his body instinctively shifting to shield me as he fired into the chaos. The world erupted, fire, bullets, shouting, the smell of blood and smoke blending into something unbearable. And all I could do was cling to him, praying that the noise would stop, that the world would still exist when it did. When the gunfire finally ceased, the silence that followed was worse. Dante turned to me, his face pale, his eyes distant, and for a heartbeat I didn't understand why his hands were trembling, why the heat around us suddenly felt colder. Then I saw it. The dark bloom of red spreading across his shirt, staining the white fabric near his ribs. Dante? I whispered, my voice breaking. He looked down, almost surprised, as if he hadn't realized what had happened, then forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. It's nothing, he said, his breath already coming shorter, shallower. Just a scratch. But it wasn't. He stumbled and I caught him, my hands pressing against the wound, the warmth of his blood seeping through my fingers. You're bleeding, I said, my voice rising, panicked. You're bleeding, oh God! He laughed softly, that low, familiar sound that always felt like a secret. You always worry too much, he murmured, his hand brushing my cheek, his thumb smearing ash across my skin. I told you I'd save you. Matteo was shouting something in the background, orders, maybe prayers, as he and the others pushed the doors open, the cold night air flooding in, heavy with rain. Dante reached for me again, his fingers tracing the outline of my jaw, his gaze fixed on my face as if he were memorizing it. Go, he whispered. Take our son. Live. I shook my head, tears blurring my vision. Not without you. But he only smiled, that same impossible smile that had ruined me from the beginning. You already saved me, he said quietly, his voice barely more than a breath. You just don't know it yet. The guards pulled me back then, Matteo shouting my name, his arm around me as the flames roared higher, consuming the doorway. Dante stumbled once, twice, and then, as if carried by the fire itself, he turned back toward the mansion, his gun still in hand, his silhouette framed by the inferno that had once been his home. Dante! I screamed, but he didn't turn. He walked into the fire like a man walking into confession, the smoke swallowing him whole. Matteo dragged me outside, into the cold rain, the world spinning around me as the mansion collapsed in on itself, the flames roaring like an angry god. I fell to my knees on the wet ground, the weight of it all pressing down on me until I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but sob his name into the night. The baby kicked then, faint, sudden, alive, and I pressed my hands to my stomach, my tears mixing with the rain. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, the dawn breaking through the smoke like the beginning of something cruelly new. They said later that no one could have survived that fire, that even Dante Moretti's body had vanished beneath the ruins, leaving nothing behind but ashes and silence. But sometimes, in the quiet hours just before morning, when the sea is calm and the wind brushes against the cliffs, I swear I can still hear him, that low, familiar voice whispering my name like a promise. Maybe he's gone. Maybe he isn't. But I know this. Some loves do not die. They burn, they ruin, they rebuild, and in their ashes they leave behind something infinite. And so I live, for him, for our son, for the mercy we never learned to name, carrying his shadow like a heartbeat, loving the man who became both my damnation and my resurrection. Because Dante Moretti didn't save me from the fire, he became it.